She had everything money could buy: the penthouse overlooking Central Park, the private jet waiting at her command, the designer wardrobe that could fund a small nation. At 47, Victoria Bennett had built an empire from nothing, transforming a struggling tech startup into a billion-dollar corporation that revolutionized digital security. Her name graced magazine covers, her opinions shaped markets, and her presence commanded any room she entered. Yet every night she returned to marble floors that echoed with emptiness. 2 gourmet meals eaten alone at a table built for 12, to a bed that felt colder than the business deals she negotiated. Then came Daniel, 26 years old, fresh out of graduate school. Hired as a junior analyst in her company's research division. He wasn't remarkable by her world's standards. He drove a 10-year-old Honda, lived in a studio apartment in Brooklyn, and wore the same 3 suits in rotation. He didn't have connections, didn't come from wealth, didn't possess the polished sophistication of the men who typically orbited her sphere. What he had was something she'd forgotten existed: an ability to see beauty in moments she'd learned to overlook. Their story didn't begin with grand romantic gestures or expensive gifts. It began with a paper cup of coffee left on her desk during a grueling 16-hour workday. Still warm, prepared exactly how she liked it. It continued with a handwritten note tucked into her quarterly report, praising not her profits, but her innovative vision. It grew through stolen conversations in hallways about art, philosophy, and dreams that had nothing to do with stock prices or quarterly earnings. What she discovered challenged everything she believed about love, success, and what truly matters when you strip away the money, the power, and the prestige. Because sometimes the richest love comes from the poorest gestures. The youngest heart can teach the wisest soul what she's been missing all along. This is the story of how a young man's simple love transformed a woman who had everything into someone who finally understood what it meant to have enough. Victoria Bennett had mastered the art of armor. Not the medieval kind, but the modern variety power suits that cost more than monthly salaries. Perfectly applied makeup that concealed any vulnerability, and a reputation for ruthlessness that kept competitors at bay and admirers at arm's length. She'd learned early that showing weakness was dangerous, that emotions were liabilities, and that love was a distraction she couldn't afford on her climb to the top. By 47, she'd achieved everything she'd set out to accomplish. Her company, Secure Tech Solutions, protected the digital assets of half the Fortune 500. She'd been featured in Forbes, Fortune, and Time. She sat on boards, advised presidents, and wielded influence that could make or break careers with a single phone call. Success had been her singular focus for 25 years. Ever since a devastating betrayal in her early 20s had taught her that trusting others was foolish and depending on anyone was weakness. Daniel Morrison arrived at her company on a rainy Tuesday in September, one of 15 new hires in the research and development division. At 26, he possessed dual master's degrees in computer science and philosophy, an unusual combination that had caught the attention of her HR director. His interview notes described him as intellectually curious but lacking corporate polish, which normally would have disqualified him. But his thesis on ethical frameworks for artificial intelligence had impressed even her most cynical senior engineers. She noticed him first during a company-wide presentation she was giving on quarterly projections. While everyone else furiously took notes on her financial forecasts, he was sketching something in the margin of his notebook. She'd felt a flash of irritation. Was he so arrogant that her presentation bored him? Later, she'd discovered he'd been drawing the architectural details of the conference room's ceiling, a beautiful Art Deco design from the 1920s that she passed under daily without ever truly seeing. Their first direct interaction was unremarkable: a brief exchange in an elevator, a nod of acknowledgement in the cafeteria, a moment when he held a door open for her with a genuine smile that seemed to expect nothing in return. She was accustomed to people wanting something from her, angling for advancement, seeking her approval or her connections. His complete lack of agenda confused her more than she cared to admit. What she couldn't know then was that this unassuming young man, with his worn leather messenger bag and his habit of quoting philosophy at unexpected moments, would dismantle every wall she'd spent decades building. Not with force, but with something far more powerful: the simple, persistent presence of someone who saw her not as Victoria Bennett, billionaire CEO, but as a woman who'd forgotten how to breathe. The crisis hit on a Wednesday at 3 a.m. when Victoria's phone erupted with emergency alerts. A zero-day exploit had compromised one of their major clients, a vulnerability no one had seen coming. She was in the office by 4 a.m., still in yoga pants and an old MIT sweatshirt, her armor abandoned in favor of functionality. By noon, she'd been awake for 30 consecutive hours, orchestrating the response, managing panicked clients, and directing her security team through the breach. The office had transformed into a war room. Senior staff moved through hallways with grim faces, junior employees whispered nervously in corners, and the air itself seemed to crackle with tension. Victoria's executive assistant had been frantically rescheduling meetings, fielding calls from the board, and trying to manage the media circus that had gathered outside their building. Every major tech publication wanted a statement, every competitor was circling, and every client was demanding reassurance. She was hunched over her laptop in the conference room, eyes burning from screen glare, when a paper cup appeared beside her keyboard. Not the bone china she usually drank from in executive meetings. Not a branded mug, but a simple paper cup from the break room on the 15th floor. She looked up to find Daniel standing there, not with the nervous deference most junior employees showed her, but with a quiet calm that seemed entirely out of place given the chaos surrounding them. "Black coffee, 2 sugars, extra hot," he said simply. "You mentioned that once in a meeting, that it's how your grandmother used to make it for you when you were studying for exams." She stared at him, genuinely shocked that anyone had been paying attention during that rare personal aside she'd made months ago during an orientation session. She'd been trying to seem relatable to new hires, telling a brief story about her roots. About the grandmother who'd raised her in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. "Thank you," she managed, and meant it more than she'd meant those words in years. He nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The exploit's elegant. Actually, whoever designed it understands poetry. There's a rhythm to the code that's almost beautiful. I've been looking at it from the philosophy angle, thinking about intention and design. I might have some insights that could help, if you're interested. Not about the technical fix your team has that covered, but about predicting what they'll do next." She should have dismissed him. He was a junior analyst, barely 3 weeks into his tenure, offering to contribute to a crisis being handled by people with decades more experience. But something in his tone wasn't arrogant, it was genuinely offering help, the way you might offer someone an umbrella in the rain. "Send me your thoughts," she heard herself say. "My private email. Tonight?" He smiled, not the calculated smile of someone who'd just gained access to the CEO's personal email, but the simple pleasure of someone happy to help. "I will." And Victoria, the use of her first name should have been presumptuous, should have earned him a cold glare. Instead, she found herself meeting his eyes with curiosity. "Drink the coffee while it's hot. You'll handle this better if you remember to take care of yourself for 5 minutes. After he left, she picked up the cup and took a sip. It was perfect, exactly how her grandmother used to make it, with cheap supermarket coffee that somehow tasted like home. Like safety, like a time before she'd learned to be invincible. The warmth spread through her chest, and for just a moment, the crisis felt manageable. Not because it was take another 48 hours to fully contain and weeks to rebuild trust with their clients, but because someone had thought to bring her coffee made with care. His email arrived at 11 p.m., long after most staff had gone home. While she was still in the office coordinating with their Asian markets as they opened for business. It wasn't a long technical document, but a thoughtful analysis of the attack pattern that suggested their adversary was trying to prove a point rather than cause maximum damage. He was right. Understanding that motivation helped them anticipate the next move and prevent further breaches. His insights, combined with her team's technical expertise, turned the tide. 3 days later, when the crisis was finally under control and she was back in her regular office, she found a small packet of her grandmother's brand of coffee on her desk, the cheap supermarket kind she hadn't seen in years. No note, no expectation of acknowledgement, just a simple gesture from someone who'd been paying attention. She made herself a cup in the private coffee maker in her office. Something she never did, always drinking whatever her assistant brought her. As she stood by the window overlooking the city, holding that paper cup, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. The dangerous, terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do everything alone. 3 weeks after the security crisis, Victoria found herself doing something unprecedented, leaving the office before 8 p.m. on a Friday. Her assistant had looked at her with undisguised shock when she'd announced she was taking the evening off, as if witnessing a natural law being violated. The truth was, she'd overheard Daniel in the cafeteria mentioning a Rothko exhibition at MoMA that was ending that weekend, and something in his enthusiastic description had stirred a memory of a person she used to be. Back in college, before ambition had consumed everything else, she told herself it was coincidence that she went that same Friday evening, that she wasn't hoping to run into him, that her decision to visit the museum had nothing to do with a 26-year-old analyst who brought her coffee and left cryptic gifts on her desk. She was simply reconnecting with culture, with art, with the parts of herself she'd neglected in pursuit of empire building. The fact that she changed outfits 3 times before leaving, abandoning her usual power suits for designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, was merely about comfort. She found him in the third gallery, standing motionless before a massive canvas of deep reds and blacks, so absorbed he didn't notice her approach. She watched him for a full minute, fascinated by the complete stillness of his attention. In her world, everyone was always performing, always aware of who was watching, always calculating angles and opportunities. But Daniel stood there as if he and the painting were the only things in existence, his expression unguarded in a way that seemed almost vulnerable. "It's like looking into the heart of something that can't speak," he said without turning around, somehow aware of her presence. Rothko said he was interested in expressing basic human emotions: tragedy, ecstasy, doom. This one feels like longing to me. The kind that lives so deep you forget it's there until something reminds you what you've been missing. He turned then, and if he was surprised to see her, he didn't show it. His smile was warm, uncomplicated, genuinely pleased, without being overeager. "You changed your interpretation," Victoria said. Remembering his cafeteria description had focused on different aspects of the work. He nodded, tilting his head thoughtfully. "Art does that, changes based on who's looking at it and what they bring to the viewing. Last week, I saw meditation in these colors. Today, I see yearning. Maybe that says more about me than the painting." His honesty was disarming. In her world, people carefully curated their revelations, never admitting weakness or need. They walked through the exhibition together, and she discovered that he didn't lecture or perform knowledge like the art collectors she knew who turned gallery visits into competitive displays of expertise. Instead, he asked questions. What did she see? What did she feel? What memories did certain colors evoke? When she hesitantly mentioned that a particular blue reminded her of summer skies in Queens, watching pigeons from her grandmother's fire escape, he didn't dismiss the mundane memory. He wanted to hear more. "You don't talk about her much, your grandmother," he observed as they sat on a bench before a triptych that demanded slow contemplation. "But when you do, your whole body language changes. Your shoulders drop, your voice softens. It's like watching you step out of armor." No one had ever noticed that before. No one had paid close enough attention to the tiny shifts in her demeanor to see past the carefully constructed executive persona. She found herself telling him things she hadn't spoken about in years. How her grandmother had worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat after Victoria's parents died in a car accident when she was 8. How she'd saved quarters in a coffee can to buy Victoria a used computer when she was 12, recognizing something in her granddaughter's fascination with technology. How she'd died of a stroke, Victoria's senior year at MIT, alone in that Queen's apartment while Victoria was taking a final exam. 2. Focused on her future to visit as often as she should have. She'd be proud of you, Daniel said with absolute certainty. Victoria shook her head, feeling the familiar guilt that lived in her chest like a stone. She'd be disappointed. I became exactly what she warned me against, someone so focused on success that I forgot why I was chasing it. She used to say that money and power are terrible masters but useful servants. I let them become my masters. She didn't know why she was confessing this to someone she barely knew. Someone so junior in her organization that HR protocol suggested she shouldn't even be speaking to him outside of professional contexts. They stayed until the museum closed. Talking about art and life, and the ways people lose themselves in pursuit of things that matter less than they think. When they finally stepped outside into the October evening, the city lights reflecting off rain-slicked streets, Daniel didn't suggest a nightcap at some expensive bar or angle for an invitation to her penthouse. He simply smiled and said, "I'm glad you came tonight. I think Rothko's paintings are meant to be discussed. And you see things in them that I never would have noticed alone." Then he headed toward the subway, leaving her standing there, feeling more seen than she had in her entire adult life. She took a car home, but spent the entire ride thinking about blue skies and fire escapes and a young man who asked what she felt instead of what she thought. New York autumn arrived with its particular brand of melancholy, sharp winds that carried the smell of roasting chestnuts and coming snow, leaves that turned the park into a riot of color before carpeting the streets in gold and rust. Victoria had always loved this season, back when she'd allowed herself to notice seasons at all. Lately, she'd become aware of how many years had passed where she'd looked out her office windows without actually seeing the world beyond the glass, where weather was just something that affected traffic patterns and whether she needed her driver to adjust his route. She'd started noticing Daniel everywhere, not because he was following her, but because she'd become attuned to his presence in ways that would have alarmed her if she'd stopped to analyze it. She knew his schedule now without meaning to learn it. Morning coffee at 7:15 a.m. in the 15th floor break room. Lunch usually brought from home and eaten at his desk while reading. Late afternoons often spent in the archives reviewing old code. Evenings that varied between staying late to work on personal projects and leaving promptly at 6 p.m., presumably to attend the graduate seminars he was still taking to round out his education. They'd fallen into a pattern of unexpected encounters that felt less like coincidence and more like the universe conspiring. Shared elevator rides where they discussed everything from quantum computing to whether hot dogs were sandwiches. Hallway conversations about books they'd both read, discovering their literary tastes overlapped in surprising ways. Brief exchanges in the cafeteria that left her smiling for hours afterward, much to her assistant's confused concern. The afternoon everything shifted was a Thursday in late October, when a sudden storm rolled in with the fury that autumn sometimes brings. Victoria had been in back-to-back board meetings all day, emerging from the conference room at 7 p.m. to find the building nearly empty and rain hammering against the windows with biblical intensity. Her driver had the day off. She'd planned to walk the 12 blocks home for exercise, and the idea of waiting hours for the storm to pass felt suffocating. She found Daniel in the lobby, also staring out at the deluge with a resigned expression. His umbrella, she could see, was one of those cheap bodega models that would surrender to the first strong gust of wind. "Looks like we're stuck," she observed, coming to stand beside him. He glanced over and that smile appeared, the one that never failed to make her feel like she was the only person in his universe for that moment. "I've been in worse situations. At least the company's good. I have an idea," she said impulsively, the words emerging before her usual filters could engage. "There's a wine bar 2 blocks from here, Vintner's Haven. They have a covered entrance we could reach if we make a run for it, and we could wait out the worst of the storm there. She was aware of how the invitation might sound, aware that she was suggesting a social outing with a junior employee, aware that she was crossing lines she'd spent her career maintaining. She was also aware that she didn't particularly care. They made the run together, her expensive coat immediately soaked, her carefully styled hair plastered to her head, her dignity abandoned somewhere between the lobby and the wine bar entrance. They arrived breathless and actually laughing in a way that made the sophisticated European couple already seated near the door look up with amused smiles. Victoria couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that, unself-consciously, like a person instead of a position. The wine bar was intimate, dimly lit, with exposed brick walls covered in vintage photographs of vineyards and old Italian villages. They were seated at a small corner table where rain-streaked windows offered a view of the storm-empty street. Daniel ordered a Barolo without consulting the price, not because he had money to burn, she suspected, but because he believed some things were worth stretching for. She found that philosophy oddly touching, this willingness to spend carefully saved money on experiences rather than possessions. Over wine that was indeed excellent, they talked about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up in Oregon, the son of school teachers who'd instilled in him a love of learning for its own sake, about backpacking through Southeast Asia after undergrad, teaching English in rural Thailand, meditating with monks in Myanmar, learning that simplicity often contained more richness than abundance. About his decision to pursue computer science, not for the money, but because he believed technology could be a tool for human flourishing if built with wisdom and care. She found herself sharing stories she'd locked away with fierce determination that had driven her to build her company after being betrayed by a business partner who'd tried to steal her initial patents and blamed her when the theft was discovered. The loneliness of success, the way each achievement had left her more isolated rather than more connected. The growing awareness that she'd won a game that didn't matter and missed out on one that did. When their fingers accidentally touched, reaching for the wine bottle at the same moment, neither of them pulled away. They sat there in the candlelight, hands barely touching. While outside, the rain washed the city clean, and inside, something equally transformative was happening to the walls around her heart. The invitation arrived via interoffice mail on a Wednesday morning. 2 weeks after their evening at the wine bar, an actual paper invitation, hand-addressed in elegant calligraphy, to the annual Comtech Innovations Gala. The event was the industry's premier networking occasion, a $1,000 per plate affair where deals were made, partnerships formed, and reputations cemented or destroyed. Victoria attended every year, usually with a professional escort or a board member, always dressed in designer armor, always performing the role of power to perfection. This year, impulsively, dangerously, she found herself standing outside Daniel's cubicle in the research department. Invitation in hand, her heart hammering in a way that made her feel absurdly adolescent. His space was exactly what she'd expected, organized but lived in, with philosophy books stacked beside technical manuals. A small plant on his desk actually alive. Unlike the expensive floral arrangements that decorated executive offices, and a framed photograph of what looked like a sunset over mountains taken from a mountaintop campsite. He looked up from his screen, surprise giving way to pleasure as he saw her. She realized this was the first time she'd come to his workspace, that she'd been unconsciously maintaining distance, even as the boundaries between them had blurred in every other way. "I have a proposition," she said, then winced at how that sounded. A professional proposition. "There's an industry gala in 3 weeks. I need a date, not a date, but someone to attend with me. My board keeps suggesting eligible bachelors they think would make good merger material, and I'd like to preempt that conversation entirely. It was a lie, or at least not the full truth." She could have invited any number of safe, appropriate companions. But watching him consider her offer, seeing the understanding dawn in his eyes that she was choosing him despite her, perhaps because of how inappropriate that choice was, she couldn't bring herself to take it back. "It's black tie," she continued. Insufferably boring networking for 6 hours, rubber chicken dinner, and speeches from people who love hearing themselves talk. I'd understand if you'd prefer root canal surgery. What time should I pick you up? He asked simply, and her heart did something complicated in her chest. You don't have to, my driver can collect us both, she started, but he shook his head. If I'm going to be your date, not date, he added with a slight smile that made her blush like a teenager. Then I'm going to do it properly. I'll pick you up, I'll open doors. I'll dance with you if there's dancing, and I'll make sure everyone in that room knows that you chose to bring me, not because I'm useful for your career, but because you enjoy my company. The directness of it stole her breath. Everyone in her world dealt in implication, suggestion, plausible deniability. But Daniel had just named the truth they'd been dancing around for months, that this was personal, that the professional pretense was wearing thin, that they both knew exactly what was happening between them, even if neither had been brave enough to acknowledge it fully. I do, she heard herself admit. Enjoy your company, I mean. Very much. Good, he said, his smile widening. Because I'm terrified of galas, and the only way I'm surviving 6 hours of networking is if I can spend them talking to you. Then, with perfect timing, his desk phone rang with an internal call, breaking the moment before it could become too much. She retreated to her office, feeling like she'd just stepped off a cliff, unsure if she was falling or flying. Her assistant noticed immediately that something had changed, but wisely said nothing about the smile Victoria couldn't quite suppress. The 3 weeks that followed were a special kind of torture. They maintained professional distance in meetings, but their eyes would meet across conference rooms, and entire conversations would happen in glances. She found excuses to visit the research department, to request his input on projects, to include him in initiatives that, strictly speaking, didn't require his involvement. He started leaving small gifts on her desk, a particularly beautiful autumn leaf, pressed in wax paper, a philosophical quote written in careful handwriting, a packet of her grandmother's coffee brand that he must have searched 3 boroughs to find. She bought a new dress for the gala, something she never did. She had a closet full of appropriate formal wear. But this time, she wanted something specific, something that made her feel not powerful but beautiful, not intimidating but approachable. She settled on midnight blue silk that flowed like water, elegant but softer than her usual choices. Her stylist commented on the unusual selection, noting it was more romantic than her typical severe designer gowns. Victoria didn't disagree. The night before the gala, she lay awake in her enormous bed, staring at the ceiling of her penthouse bedroom, acknowledging what she'd been avoiding for months. She was falling in love with Daniel Morrison. Not the infatuation of youth. She was too old for that, had been around too many blocks to confuse chemistry with connection. This was deeper, more frightening. He'd seen past her money and her power to the woman she'd buried under decades of ambition. And rather than being intimidated or opportunistic, he'd simply liked what he found. Tomorrow night, she'd stand beside him in front of the entire industry, and everyone would know that something had shifted. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt alive for the first time in years. Daniel arrived at precisely 7 p.m., wearing a tuxedo that must have required significant investment but was perfectly tailored, making him look both younger and more sophisticated than his usual office attire suggested. Victoria's doorman had called up with poorly concealed surprise that a Mr. Morrison is here for Ms. Bennet, and she'd felt an absurd flutter of nerves as she rode the private elevator down to the lobby. She found him standing by the entrance, holding a single gardenia knot, the elaborate bouquets wealthy suitors usually offered, but one perfect flower with a scent that immediately transported her to her grandmother's tiny garden plot in Queens. You look, ... double quotes. He paused, searching for words with unusual care, like starlight. If starlight could be bottled and turned into a person, it was an absurd thing to say. Poetic to the point of ridiculousness, and she loved it because it was so completely unafraid to be sincere in a world drowning in calculated cool. He pinned the gardenia to her dress with surprising deftness. his fingers barely brushing the silk, and she found herself holding her breath at the nearness of him. The gala was at the plaza, because of course it was. Where else would the tech industry elite gather to congratulate itself? The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and carefully curated success. Filled with people Victoria had known for years, but never truly allowed herself to know. She saw heads turn as they entered together, saw the calculations happening in real time as people assessed this unexpected pairing. Victoria Bennett, Ice Queen of Tech Security, with an unknown young man who clearly wasn't from their world. The whispers were immediate, barely concealed behind champagne, flutes, and canapes. Daniel seemed entirely unbothered by the attention, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back as they navigated the crowded gesture that was protective without being possessive, supportive without being controlling. When James Rothschild, a venture capitalist who'd been pursuing Victoria for years, approached with barely concealed hostility, Daniel extended his hand with genuine friendliness. Daniel Morrison. I work in research at SecureTech. You're the one who funded that brilliant clean water initiative in Somalia, aren't you? I read about it in The Economist's fascinating approach to sustainable development. She watched James's expression shift from confrontational to flattered. Watched him engage Daniel in a conversation about international development that revealed her date had done his homework, not about the industry players she'd expected him to research, but about their personal interests and pet projects. Within minutes, James was laughing, genuinely charmed, the territorial aggression completely diffused. Throughout the evening, Daniel repeated this performance with everyone who approached with skepticism or judgment, disarming them not with money or connections, but with authentic curiosity and sincere interest in their passions. Dinner was indeed rubber chicken, or perhaps it was excellent cuisine, and she simply couldn't taste anything because she was hyper-aware of Daniel beside her. His quiet commentary on the speeches making her struggle not to laugh inappropriately. He's saying disruption like it's a sacred incantation, Daniel whispered during a particularly pompous address. I think if you say it 3 times while spinning in a circle, venture capital appears. She'd pressed her napkin to her mouth, shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter, feeling more like herself than she had in decades. Then came the dancing, the part of these events she usually avoided, claiming work calls or urgent emails. But when the orchestra began and Daniel offered his hand with a slight bow that was both ironic and sincere, she found herself following him to the floor. He danced well, not with the polished perfection of someone who'd taken formal lessons, but with natural rhythm and an attentiveness to her movements that made following him effortless. You're full of surprises, she murmured as they moved across the floor. My mother insisted, he explained, said that every person should know how to dance, change a tire, and make a meal from scratch. The essential skills for being fully human. They turned slowly under the chandeliers, and she became aware that the whispers had shifted. People were watching them, not with judgment now, but with something else, curiosity, perhaps even a touch of envy. Because whatever this was between them, it was real, in a room full of transactional relationships and strategic pairings. They're staring, she said quietly, and felt his hand tighten slightly at her waist. Let them, he replied. They're seeing Victoria Bennett happy. That's probably more disruptive to their worldview than any technology innovation you've ever launched. The truth of it made her laugh, a real laugh that drew more eyes, more attention. She'd spent decades being admired, feared, respected, but she couldn't remember the last time someone had watched her with the expression she saw on these faces, recognition of joy. As the song ended, he didn't immediately release her. They stood there for a heartbeat longer than appropriate. Close enough that she could feel his breath, see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, understand that they'd crossed a line tonight that couldn't be uncrossed. Thank you for bringing me, he said softly. This is a night I'll remember forever. She wanted to tell him that everything had changed, that she couldn't go back to pretending this was just friendship or mentorship or any of the safe labels they might have applied. But they were in public, surrounded by her industry, and some confessions required privacy. So she simply squeezed his hand and led him back to their table, knowing that the real conversation would come later. The confrontation came 3 days after the gala, in the form of Richard Chen standing in her office doorway, with an expression that mixed concern and disapproval in equal measure. Richard was her CFO, her closest professional confidant, one of the few people who'd been with her since the company's early days, when they'd worked from a rented office in Queens and survived on takeout and ambition. He closed the door behind him with deliberate care, and Victoria felt her defenses rise instinctively. "We need to talk about Daniel Morrison," he said without preamble, and her jaw tightened. She'd known this was coming, had felt the scrutiny intensify after the gala, had noticed the careful way her executive team now mentioned his name, as if testing her reaction. "He's a junior analyst with less than 3 months tenure who you've somehow made into your personal project. The optics are problematic, Victoria. People are talking. Let them talk," she said coldly, recognizing even as she spoke that she sounded defensive, which only proved Richard's point. "He's brilliant, Richard. His insights during the security breach were invaluable. His work on the ethical AI framework is groundbreaking. I'm mentoring a talented employee. When did that become controversial?" But they both knew it was more than mentoring, and the lie hung between them like smoke. Richard sat down uninvited, a power move that would have irritated her from anyone else, but from him signaled concern rather than challenge. "You're 47 years old, one of the most powerful women in tech, and you're dating someone young enough to be ... double quotes, he paused, recalculating. "Well, not your son, but certainly inappropriate by any HR standard. I'm not judging, mine worried. This could undermine everything you've built. The board is already asking questions. Shareholders are noticing. And if this goes south, he could have legal recourse that would cost you millions and tank the company's reputation." The words landed like blows because they articulated every fear she'd been suppressing for months. She was risking everything: her reputation, her company, her carefully constructed professional persona for what? Romance. At her age, with someone who earned a fraction of her wealth and had nothing to offer but conversation and coffee and genuine affection. It seemed absurd when laid out in the harsh light of corporate liability, and yet the thought of walking away from Daniel made her chest tighten with something approaching panic. "We're not dating," she said finally, aware of how weak the denial sounded. "We're friends. We enjoy each other's company. Is that now prohibited in my own company?" Richard's expression softened into something approaching pity, which somehow felt worse than judgment. "Victoria, I've known you for 23 years. I watched you build this empire, one brutal negotiation at a time. I saw you sacrifice relationships, health, peace of mind in pursuit of success. I've never once seen you look at anyone the way you looked at him on that dance floor." She turned to stare out her window at the Manhattan skyline, that view she'd bought with decades of 80-hour weeks and ruthless prioritization. "What if I'm tired, Richard? Tired of being careful, tired of optimizing every decision for shareholder value, tired of treating my life like a quarterly earnings report?" "Then step down," Richard said bluntly. "Take a sabbatical, appoint yourself executive chair, and hire a CEO. You've earned the right to live however you want, but not while maintaining a professional relationship with a subordinate employee half your age. The legal exposure alone is staggering. If this relationship ends badly, he could claim harassment, abuse of power, hostile work environment. Even if he doesn't, even if this is the great love story of the century, the appearance of impropriety damages the company. You know this. You've built your entire career on being above reproach." The truth of it settled over her like a heavy coat. She'd spent decades understanding that perception mattered as much as reality, that reputation was currency in business, that one scandal could undo years of careful reputation management. Everything Richard said was correct from a risk management perspective: the responsible choice, the professional choice. The choice the old Victoria would make without hesitation was to end whatever was developing with Daniel immediately. Transfer him to another division or encourage him to find opportunities elsewhere. Return to the safe loneliness of her corner office. "Give me time," she said finally. "I need to think." Richard stood, his expression troubled but sympathetic. "Don't take too long. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to contain. I'm not the enemy here, Victoria. I'm the friend trying to save you from yourself." After he left, she sat in her office until long after the building emptied, watching the city lights blink on as darkness fell, weighing everything she'd built against everything she'd missed. Wondering if it was possible to have both, or if life always demanded impossible choices. Victoria requested a meeting with Daniel in neutral territory, not her office with its power dynamics, not a romantic restaurant with its implications, but the sculpture garden at MoMA on a cold Saturday afternoon in late November. She arrived early, pacing among the bronze and stone figures like a defendant awaiting verdict, rehearsing speeches that all sounded either too cold or too vulnerable. When she saw him approaching, hands in his coat pockets, breath visible in the winter air, her carefully prepared words evaporated entirely. "I need to be honest with you about something," she began without preamble, standing beside a Giacometti sculpture that seemed to embody the fragility she felt. "Richard came to my office this week. The board is asking questions. There are concerns about impropriety, about power dynamics, about the age difference and what it looks like for the CEO to be spending so much time with a junior analyst. He's right to be concerned from a legal and professional standpoint. What's happening between us is problematic at best, potentially catastrophic at worst." She watched his expression carefully, saw understanding dawn without surprise, as if he'd been expecting this conversation. "I see," he said quietly. "And you're here to tell me that we need to maintain professional distance. That whatever this is," he gestured between them, "it's too risky for someone in your position. That I should probably look for opportunities elsewhere to avoid continued awkwardness. That would be the responsible choice," Victoria acknowledged, her voice catching slightly. "The safe choice. The choice that protects everything I've built over 25 years. Richard suggested I could step back, take a sabbatical, appoint myself executive chair, hire a CEO to handle day-to-day operations, remove myself from the direct power dynamic. But that feels like a coward's solution, restructuring my entire career around a relationship that might not even work out." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying the sculpture with apparent fascination. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "Can I tell you what I think? Not as your employee, not as someone who has anything to gain or lose, but as someone who cares about you." She nodded, not trusting her voice. He turned to face her fully, and his eyes held something she'd learned to recognize: absolute sincerity without any protective irony. "I think you're afraid. Not of the board or the legal implications, or even the gossip you've faced down worse than that, and one, you're afraid that if you choose this, choose me, choose something as impractical and vulnerable as love, you'll prove that all your success doesn't actually protect you from being hurt. That opening yourself up to happiness means opening yourself up to loss. And loss is the one thing all your money and power can't prevent." The accuracy of it stole her breath. She felt exposed in a way that was both terrifying and strangely relieving, as if he'd named something she'd been carrying in silence for decades. "My grandmother," she said slowly, "died while I was taking an exam. I was so focused on achieving, on building security through success, that I missed the last 6 months of her life. I've been telling myself for 25 years that it was worth it, that my choices led to empire, and empire justifies everything. But what if I've just been running from intimacy, because intimacy means risking that kind of loss again?" "Then stop running," Daniel said simply. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, or blow up your career, or do anything dramatic. I'm asking you to be brave enough to let someone love you, To acknowledge that what we have is real and worth exploring, even if it's complicated and unconventional and makes people uncomfortable. You've spent your whole life playing it safe emotionally while taking enormous professional risks. Maybe it's time to balance that equation. She thought about Richard's warnings, about the board's concerns, about everything she risked by choosing this path. Then she thought about paper cups of coffee made with care, about being seen for who she was rather than what she'd accomplished. About standing in a wine bar with rain outside and realizing she'd been holding her breath for 25 years. "I'm going to restructure," she said, decision crystallizing even as she spoke. "Not to hide the relationship, but because you're right, I've been using work to avoid living. I'll appoint Richard as CEO. I'll move to executive chair. I'll still be involved, but create space for other things. For art and philosophy and long conversations that don't have quarterly earnings implications." "For us?" Daniel asked, and there was vulnerability in the question that matched her own. She took his hand the first time she'd initiated physical contact. The first time she'd allowed herself to reach for what she wanted without calculation or strategy. "For us," she confirmed, "if you're willing to date someone who has no idea how to do this, who'll probably be terrible at it, who has 2 decades of emotional armor to dismantle." He smiled. That smile that had undone her from the beginning and squeezed her hand. "I think you'll figure it out. You're pretty good at learning new things." They stood there in the sculpture garden as winter afternoon faded into evening, to people from completely different worlds choosing to build something together. Something that couldn't be measured in stock prices or quarterly reports, but might be worth more than everything she'd accumulated. In her decades of chasing success, 6 months later, Victoria stood in her grandmother's old Queens neighborhood. Daniel beside her, looking at a renovated community center they'd funded together, a space offering free coding classes and business mentorship to kids who reminded her of who she'd been at their age. The announcement of her transition to executive chair had caused brief market turbulence, but Richard had proved himself more than capable, and SecureTech stock had actually risen as investors recognized the strength of the leadership team she'd built. Her relationship with Daniel was public now, had weathered the initial scandal with surprising resilience, largely because they refused to hide or apologize or perform for anyone's comfort. They simply existed together, openly, to people who'd found connection across an age gap that mattered less than everyone assumed it should. The tech world had moved on to newer controversies, as it always did. She'd learned that love from Daniel came in the simplest gestures: coffee made exactly right, books left on her nightstand with passages marked that made him think of her, quiet evenings where they read side by side without needing conversation. His patient presence as she learned to dismantle decades of emotional protection. He'd taught her that wealth measured in moments mattered more than wealth measured in dollars. That success without someone to share it with was just elaborate loneliness. That being vulnerable wasn't weakness, but the greatest courage of all. She'd discovered that at 48 she could still be surprised by joy, could still learn new ways of being, could still choose differently than she'd chosen for decades. As they walked through the neighborhood where she'd grown up, past the apartment building where her grandmother had raised her, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, a sense of home that had nothing to do with real estate values. Daniel had shown her that the richest love comes not from grand gestures or expensive gifts, but from the simple, persistent choice to see someone fully and love them anyway. She'd spent 25 years building an empire. Now, finally, she was learning to build a life, and perhaps that was the greatest success of all.